First, let me say buenas tardes. All right, thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you. My name is Sid Wilson. I am the board chairman of the Friends of the American Latino Museum. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you on the campus of USC. For those that aren't aware of our organization, we are the only organization in the country dedicated exclusively to the mission of creating a new Smithsonian museum dedicated to Latino history and culture. This has been a project that has been almost more than 20 years in the making. For us to have our presence, to have our story, to have our place within the Smithsonian institutions. And so, we've been doing town hall meetings throughout the year, and it's great to save the last town hall meeting for the best city, a city that's so rich with Latino culture, rich with Latino history, here in Los Angeles, California. And so we're so glad to be here. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I do want to quickly recognize, of course, we have two of our board members that are also here. You have Jonathan Yorba, who was our past board chair. Jonathan, stand be recognized. And of course, John Huerta. Thanks, stand be recognized, John, who also was very helpful to the commission when the commission was putting together our report. So over the next 2 hours, we invite you to hear from academic experts, from civil rights leaders, leaders in the museum industry, and other museum innovators. But we want to make sure that you too are participating in this. And so we don't want this to be just a presentation of experts. We want this to be an opportunity for this to be an interactive conversation. So be sure to write down any and all questions. I believe they're going to be passing around cards to where you can actually write down questions to the panelists when at the time when we're ready for for Q&A. And then let me also of course thank so many of our team. Estuardo Rodriguez, of course, our executive director. You can wave, Estuardo. Thanks, Estuardo, and of course Francella, Chinchilla. And so many of us that we do this because, what we're doing when this is all said and done is this is a mission to say the time has come to have our presence on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. For those of you that have ever been to Washington, you know that you have all the Smithsonian institutions there. And for many of us that have ever been to a Smithsonian, we say, well, where's our story? Where's the Latino story? ¿Dónde está nuestra historia? And so we know that this is an initiative, this is a mission to do this. And with your help and with your support, that will become a reality. And so I want to say thank you for all of you for being here. So let's get started. I'm going to present our moderator for this afternoon. Many of you know him. He's a highly respected leader, Roberto Suro, who's with the Tomás Rivera Policy Institute. Roberto has a joint appointment as a professor at the Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism and the Price School of Policy here at USC. And before coming to USC in 2007, Roberto was a director of the Pew Hispanic Center. Of course, we all know about the Pew Hispanic Center and the great work that they do, and which he founded in 2001. And he was also on the team that launched the Pew Research Center in 2004. A board member for the independent sector and trustee for the Haynes Foundation, Suro has overseen the production of over 100 publications and more than 36 books, chapters, and reports. So as you can see, he is someone with deep knowledge of our Latino community and the history of our Latino community. And so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Roberto Suro to the podium. Please give him a big warm round of applause. Thank you so much, Roberto.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, let me welcome you all to USC. It's a great pleasure and an honor for us to be hosting this event here. And for me, it's a very special moment personally, and I'm going to just take the moderator's privilege to share with you a personal story. I grew up in Washington, D.C. and spent, like any native, spent a lot of time taking relatives and visitors down to the mall to see the sights. But recall very vividly in April of 1961, my father, who was then ill, died not long afterwards. Took a week, it was the week after Easter, and we got on the bus every day and went down and said, all right, we're going to go building by building, room by room, because this is the great school. This is a place where you can learn about everything. And there was an element of patriotic kind of devotion to this too. My father was from Puerto Rico. He was very proud of being an American. At the same time, he insisted that we only spoke Spanish together, and the whole time we were going through every room in the museum, we were reading the labels and everything in English, but speaking in Spanish, and it was really quite a remarkable experience. It was a much smaller place than it is now. This is before even the Museum of American History was built. And space wasn't, a concept yet, let alone a museum. Now vaster, 7 million or so people a year, still the great school, more so the school of being an American. And what this effort is about is making that school more complete. My excitement today about the discussion we're going to have is that it's not only a matter of adding content to what's already there, but a different way of telling stories, a different way of speaking about history, a different way of speaking of the experience of being living in the country that we all share. We Latinos have stories that are not told, stories that beg to be told with our own colors and our own voices. So today we have a very excellent group of people who will be talking about that, about how a Latino museum will bring about many innovations, many different colors, many different voices, many different ideas to the National Mall. Not just a new collection of artifacts, but new kinds of narratives, new kinds of stories, new ways of telling stories. It's not a matter of just filling a gap, but of enhancing, illuminating, and expanding that great space. That great school that is the National Mall it won't be what its potential. It can't be complete. It can't be what it needs to be without this museum. So with that charge in front of us, let me call the first three panelists to the stage and introduce them. Our first panelist comes from UCLA. Dr. Chon Noriega has been the director of the Chicano Studies Research Center since 2002. As a professor in the UCLA Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media, he has edited 9 books on Latino media, performance, and visual arts. He was named one of the top 100 most influential Hispanics by Hispanic Business and co-founded the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, a 500-member organization. Chon, please come and join us. Our second panelist, also from UCLA, we bear no grudges here, no, we're not going to go there, is currently a professor of medicine and director of the UCLA Center for the Study of Latino Health and Culture at the School of Medicine. Dr. Bautista received the Herbert W. Nickens Award from the Association of American Medical Colleges for his outstanding contributions to promote justice in medical education and health equality in the United States. He has published various works in family medicine, the American Journal of Public Health, Family Practice, Medical Care, a great many publications. This resume doesn't begin to tell you the richness of David's mind, so I'm not going to go on further. It's just it would take us all afternoon to talk about that. And finally, we have Pilar Tompkins Rivas. Thank you. Pilar is coordinator of curatorial initiatives at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She has over 15 years of experience in directorial and leadership positions in the arts and has curated and organized over 60 exhibitions nationally and internationally since 2002. Her extensive experience in California extends from the 18th Street Art Center, UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, and the Claremont Museum of Art, among many other institutions. Please join us, Pilar. So, in a very rough sense, we have two panels in a very general way. The first one, we're going to talk mostly about the content, the messages, the stories, the audience that will, and the experience of being in a Latino museum. The second is much more on the medium, on the way this content will be conveyed, how this museum will look and feel in a way that's different than other museums. And there's some overlap back and forth, of course. So I'm going to come and continue here. In between, I don't know if, can we announce that the congressman's coming? Yes. So in the middle of this, we're expecting Congressman Xavier Becerra, who has really been the critical player in Congress in moving this initiative along now for many, many years. And he'll be here briefly between the two panels. And we'll also show a clip from a new movie about Cesar Chavez. And then we'll take questions after the first panel, and questions after the second panel, and then have the exchange afterwards. So, for all of you just generally, what I'm interested in having us chat about is what's distinguishing, what's unique about the content of a Latino museum. For sure, we know that there are different events, different people, but more broadly, the question is, are there different ways of doing history, different ways of telling stories, different ways of organizing a museum space that you would think of associated with this idea of a Latino museum? I've got some specific questions for each of you that I'll ask you in turn, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation. So don't go on too long on these first ones. I'm going to start with you, Chon. So you've been a very important figure in defining Chicano studies as an academic discipline now for many, many years. What I'm curious about is how the process of reconstructing history, the process of telling the stories of the past is different when you come to that process from the perspective of Chicano studies. When you begin from the point of view of the study of a very distinct segment of the Latino population.
Yeah, I think the first thing that one encounters when writing about or doing research on a Chicano, Cuban American, Puerto Rican, Dominican, even say broadening within the realm of the Spanish Empire to Filipino, the materials you need to tell that story are not in an archive. Or if they are in an archive, they have not been described in a way that will make it easy for you to find them. And that's a failure of acquisition. It's also a failure of description. And so when I began my first book on filmmakers, I had to call up the filmmakers. Moctesuma Esparza will be here later. I'd call him up and say, can I interview you? Can I look at the papers you have? But the next step, and I think this speaks to an ethics, is to do everything in my power to bring those materials into an archival setting. Wherever, as long as they are properly preserved and made accessible in the broadest way possible. And by that I mean described in a way not just to draw out some ethnic specific idea, but the full range of humanity and the full participation of that person. We're now gathering papers for a Puerto Rican artist who's about to turn 80, created the first Latino art museum in the country and the world. But the challenge, I think, is not just to draw out his Puerto Ricanness, but the fact that he was actually at the vanguard and ahead of major shifts in modern art worldwide. And we have to go back and claim that. We have to go back and say, it's not just that he was the first Puerto Rican to do something, he was the first person to pioneer in key areas that are now considered central to understanding contemporary world art. So I think, you know, I'll leave it at that, except to say that when you then go to write this stuff up, what story do you tell? And I think probably the most limiting one is the story, we've been left out and here we are. Because that accepts the framework that left you out. The next is to say, well, we belong somewhere else. Screw you. We're going to go to this other place over here and define it as the opposite of you. And in some cases that works, but it again leaves that framework unchallenged. I think the most difficult, because you assume a responsibility no one else has taken upon themselves, you reframe the story in which not only you fit, but everyone else fits. And that's why I'm interested in an artist like Rafael Ortiz, an educator like Sal Castro, business leaders, as a political figure, is you can tell that larger story over again, starting with them. And you end up with a much better story of what American culture is. So.
Thank you. David, this leads very nicely into my question about some of your recent work. Leaving aside all of your history as a physician and medical researcher, you lately have been doing some fascinating work that is about uncovering history and remaking stories in a way that not only change our understanding of the past, but change our understanding of the present. I mean, to me, that's history in its purest form. That if you could share with us some of your recent work on Cinco de Mayo and in that thought process of how history changes the way we see the present, I think would be really helpful here.
Oh, certainly. Because in fact, I think the story of the Cinco de Mayo also reminds us how quickly we can forget. I mean, how many people here have heard of Cinco de Mayo? See, raise a hand. Okay, just about everybody. It's probably the most widely celebrated Latino event in the country, from Boston to LA, Seattle to Miami. But you know, you can go to any one of these celebrations and ask, but why are we celebrating? Nobody knows. Okay, that tells us something. So, I'm not going to bore you. I'm going to give you the 30-second story. Why do we celebrate the Cinco de Mayo? Well, we need to understand it's not a Mexican holiday. Because if it were, they'd celebrate all over Mexico, and our celebrations here would just be pale imitations. But instead, it's, no, the other way around. Hey, we start a week before, the whole Semana de la Raza, we go a week after, and in Mexico, what are you guys celebrating? Okay, so it's not a Mexican holiday. What is el Cinco de Mayo? Why was it begun? When? By whom? The Cinco de Mayo was a commemoration begun here in Los Angeles in the early days of the American Civil War as a public statement of where Latinos stood on the issues of the Civil War. That Latinos opposed slavery, they supported freedom. Latinos opposed white supremacy, they supported racial equality. They opposed elitist forms of government. They supported the notion of self-government via democracy. And that is why they began making these statements via parades, via speeches, all sorts of things about the Civil War and its relationship to the French intervention. Now, what's interesting is we forgot that. Oh, Cinco de Mayo. Isn't the Mexican Independence Day? I've heard all sorts of theories. What's fascinating, some of you may have seen the story in the LA Times about 3 or 4 months ago about Ernest Marquez. He's a descendant of the holders of the Rancho Boca de Santa Monica. Okay, actually he's a descendant of Juan Francisco Reyes, who arrived in California in 1769. Okay, you can't have a longer Latino history in California than that. What was interesting, I was going to meet him this summer, so I looked on my data set. And I discovered 6 of his ancestors who formulated the very first Cinco de Mayo here in Los Angeles in 1862. I discovered 2 of his ancestors who rode with the Spanish-speaking cavalry, the Native California Cavalry, to fight the Confederates and the French. So I met him and I said, by the way, did you know you had these ancestors? He had no idea. And his family had helped to create the commemoration of Cinco de Mayo. In fact, it explains something to him. His grandfather, Pascual Marquez, in 1894 had donated land to the Los Angeles Unified School District. But the specification of this deed of grant was that that school, it's the Canyon School, it still operates, it's there in Pacific Palisades, and now it's a charter school, is that they had to celebrate Cinco de Mayo every year. And he has a picture of him in the 1930s, a little 6th grader, doing the Michoacano Danza de los Viejos. And he wondered, why am I doing this? It wasn't until this year, he's now 92 years or 89 years of age, he finally discovered why the Cinco de Mayo. It's not Mexican independence, it's not Cinco de Mayo, it is a civil rights holiday over issues that are still germane today. As we look at the anti-immigrant legislation, and particularly some of the draconian laws in Alabama and Georgia, if you gave a bottle of water to an undocumented immigrant dying of thirst, you had just broken the law. Hello, we need freedom. It's about racial equality. It's about political participation, voter registration. They're still trying to suppress the vote. I'd like us to take back the Cinco de Mayo, take it back from Cinco de Mayo, and let's take it back to its roots. It is civil rights. It is defining our right to be here. And these civic values we got, not because we assimilated them, they were here when California was part of Mexico. Every single Latin American republic, upon achieving independence, abolished slavery, got rid of racial restrictions on civil rights. It's just a very Latino way to do things.
All right, so Pilar, you have great experience in curating, that great gift of organizing communal experiences, of creating ways of learning when materials are collected in a physical space in a way that educates and excites people. I want to ask you to spend some time with us thinking about how that would be different in a Latino museum, how the curatorial art would be expressed differently in that context, in a way that the sensibility or the experience of being in a Latino museum would be different than that of others museums.
Thanks for that question, and I'm also really happy to be speaking on behalf of the museum and advocating for it, because I've been aware of it since 2006, and having worked in the contemporary art world since about 2002, it's always been a conundrum. Where is the support for Latino art? How can we bring our artists into mainstream museums? How can we increase representation and diversify the story that's being told through the canon of American art? And I also have a background in Latin American art as well. And the interesting, problematic for Latino art and Latino artists and art culture in general is that it falls somehow outside of American art and somehow outside of Latin American art. So we are in this negative space, and this is a real challenge from a curatorial perspective, because you need support on so many other levels. So it's important to understand how museums function in general, to understand why a Latino museum is important and what place that kind of an institution would serve in the national kind of scope of large-scale museums. So it's complicated, but I will start by telling a funny story. In that I was asked to curate a Latino exhibition at a museum where I worked with my colleague Evonne Gallardo, who's going to present later, and I wanted to do a show that wasn't labeled a Chicano show, but I was basically being asked to do one. And so I decided to do an inquiry into women's contributions into the punk music scene from East LA. So I was focusing on Chicanas and punk and that legacy. And so this was approved to go forward, and it brought a lot of attention to the museum, and people got very excited. And then the founder of the museum, who was the head of the board of directors, finally realized about a week before we were about to open that it was an exhibition about punk music. And she got really, really upset and told me over the phone in a private phone conversation that this particular museum was supported by white people's money. And so I didn't have the authority in her mind to do whatever I wanted to do for presenting a different kind of story than what she thought was the most acceptable one, which she imagined something more folkloric or something like that. So she said she understood that Latinos were growing in numbers and that that they were one day going to have enough capital to be able to support their own institutions, and when that day happened, that they could do their own shows in those kinds of spaces. So this was something that was told to me not that long ago, and we had to disprove that person and make an incredible success out of that exhibition and show women artists and conventional approaches to contemporary art making that move outside of painting and drawing, and that are transdisciplinary, that show a really exciting and vibrant and energetic movement that continues today, and offer something that is unexpected and rich about the pantheon of Latino art production. So having a Latino museum would give us a platform where we can start to have all kinds of conversations. So we're not relegated to having kind of a one-off exhibition that might happen every 10 years, which has been the case thus far in institutions in California, for example, where within that one opportunity that you're given, you're expected to include everything and everybody. And our story is so much broader than that. It's not a monolith. Latino population is certainly, diverse across the United States, and there are so many multiple stories to be told. So from a curator's perspective, having the opportunity to just begin to tell those stories from within the framework that we can just start having that conversation is really exciting. And I have one last example I wanted to point out was that the current exhibition at the Smithsonian American Art Museum has a wonderful, it's a wonderful show curated by Carmen Ramos called Our America, or Nuestra America. And this exhibition, she's the first curator of Latino art that's been hired at that museum. So there hasn't ever been a precedent of showing Latino art, so that's important to note. And with this exhibition, she was able to bring in a number of works, and I think the majority of the show, into the collection, which is really critical because it ensures that the works will then become part of the public trust. The American public trust, the national public trust. So that's very, very important. And the exhibition itself received a really terrible and negative review from the Washington Post, which maybe some people followed that exchange. And the critic was dismissive of the whole idea of Latino art, and basically trying to just shut that down as even a concept that you can even start to talk about. And that kind of diminishing approach is something that you hear every time there's an exhibition that focuses on Latino art that reaches a national platform. So those are the things that we're working against in the field now, and so having a Latino museum, I think it would give us some equity, some equitable playing field to be able to operate to do what we do.
I mean, that brings us, and we have a little bit of time for conversation here. I'd like to engage the three of you on an issue that comes up in Latino studies, art exhibits, the discussion of this museum, which is how do you build a whole out of a people, a story that is made up of so many diverse parts. And that was one of the criticisms of Nuestra America, and it's something that comes up. It has come up in the discussion of this museum, that it's a very fragmented thing that you're trying to put under one roof.
Well, my first response is that issue should be taken up by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and other museums that take as their framework a national complexity that includes not only that incredible complexity that apparently no one can deal with of Latinos, but everybody else. And I think that, you know, what Philip Kennicott did in the review, he's a very good art reviewer, but very good art reviewers often really get very tied up when confronting something that they don't understand. And the first impulse is to reject the category in its entirety in ways that apply to almost everything else they review. He's reviewed shows of American art. How do you take the complexity of American art, which is the 50 million Latinos and another 250 million people, and in any way think that you can have a coherent, understandable message to say about that and somehow not be missing something? You know, my frustration in terms of museums, we had a very good show in New York at El Museo del Barrio. I had done many programs at the Whitney Museum. I went and looked at their biennial. And it was not only a bad show 3 years ago, I mean, it was a bad show. It also didn't have a single Latino artist. The New York Times reviews our show and says, why do we even need these shows? The Whitney Biennial has solved that problem because 50% of the artists are women. I was like, we weren't, you know, yes, 50% of the artists in our show are women too, but there are no Latinos. There are very few artists of color in period, and no one's asking that question. And just to go a little bit further, because last summer, Christopher Knight, who's the critic here in LA at the LA Times, did a very good study. He looked at 5 major museums in the area, and he said, solo shows are really the lifeblood of a museum. It shows what they think is important, individual artist. He looked at the 5 major museums, and he said, let's look at the percentage of women in the solo shows. Went to LACMA, MoCA, the Getty, and what he found was that only 20% of the solo shows were focused on women. Whereas at the Hammer, which was the only museum directed by a woman, 50%. That's fascinating, and it's really good that he did that. I wonder what it looks like in terms of race. So I went back over that same 5-year period and I found that 2 of the museums had 0% shows of individual artists of color that were Americans. And I found that the other 2 had 7%, which meant 2 shows each, and I curated one of them. Okay. That question wasn't asked. I then looked at the non-national artist. If you were a Latin American artist, you had a 50% higher chance of having a solo show in Los Angeles than if you were a US-born Latino American artist. And again, that question wasn't asked. But when a show that's, one, attempting to do a compensatory movement within an institution, but is also just trying to show some good work, when that show gets out there, the critics think that that's the moment to question the category. I think I want to emphasize this in terms of what Pilar brought up, because this question has been called in terms of the national institutions. And what that article does is undermine efforts that have been very hard won over the last decade to get Carmen Ramos, who's Dominican American, in there as a curator, to get Taina Caragol, who's Puerto Rican, into the National Portrait Gallery. They are both on soft money. Those are not ongoing positions. They have to continue to be fought for. And they in no ways become irrelevant when there's an American Latino museum. You need both of these things.
Do you want to add?
Well, part of this, I think, stems from a real lack of understanding of who the hell are we as Latinos, Sierra Latinos. What does that mean? I like Carlos Fuentes' terms as he's looking at Latin America, that what we call Latin America in academia. He calls it, no, not Latin America, Indo-Afro-Ibero-America. Yeah, Indo-Afro-Ibero-America. And also there's Asian, by the way. He left that out, but that's okay. That's who we are. And we're the meeting of those people over the past 500 years. And we have been creating things. And then 150 years ago, suddenly, posh, some of us suddenly become U.S. citizens. And now we're here, then others have arrived. We're Latinos de Estados Unidos, becoming bilingual and bicultural for 150 years in this state. We're sort of our own version of America. Somos americanos. Right? That's the problem. They always think they're the only Americans. Somos americanos, todos. Everybody here in this room, you're here. Somos americanos. We need to have them understand this is part of that larger hemispheric experience, the variant here in what's now Estados Unidos. We are a regional variant, if you will, of American identity. But we're different. We're virtual regional. You know, to be a Southern, you got to be in the South, Texas, in Texas. We're virtual all over the United States, and then we connect all over Latin America. We're a much broader entity, and I think the critic forgot to get his arms out. He's looking like, well, are you Amish or something?
Well, I would just kind of like to go back to an idea of just how institutions work and function, and how that might play into some of these kinds of responses that have come up in regards to Latino art exhibitions. I really believe that art is the keeper of our culture. So in the East Coast, there's a culture of philanthropy for the arts, and that has translated into very strong museums and institutions. And you can kind of see, from the perspective of how those museums function, what kinds of works are presented based on who is funding them, and what kinds of families have been there to support them. When you're considering Latino art, we're playing catch up with so many different things. Chon kind of was speaking to the question of scholarship and building up an academic approach to really kind of mining Latino artists, their archives, doing a lot of primary research that has to be done from an academic perspective. We also have to have collectors that help to support and fund artists so that they can sustain themselves. Beyond that, we have to have curators, as he was kind of pointing out, that these two very tenuous positions, which are brand new in our national museums. And there are really only a handful of Latino curators working in major museums across the country. It's a pretty limited group, so you also have to increase the amount of curators that are actively working in the field. You have to increase support from the institutions' perspective of why they feel it's even important to do exhibitions that pertain to Latino culture and art. So all of those things come hand in hand. You have to have foundations that are interested in supporting that as well, that are going to give you money. So I feel like we have the artist and we have the art. We have the history, all that is there. These other parts we're still working towards. And I think that there is a lot of, there can be backlash, and there's a lot of ill-informed people that need to be educated as we move forward in all those fronts.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. I think this has been, what I've taken away, one of many thoughts that I'm left with after hearing the three of you, is that the challenge here is to create a Latino place within this great national institution that's the Smithsonian. But at the same time, by doing that, to change the whole of the institution. The first goal, a vital goal, an essential goal, is to create that place where all this material is archived, where it's expressly collected in a way that can be seen and accessed. But beyond that, there is this transformative function that could be exercised, that should affect every one of those buildings on the mall eventually, with bringing in the kind of people Pilar was talking about, telling the stories the way that David was talking about. So we're not quite even at the halfway point, and we've already had a great session, if I say so myself. Thank you. let me introduce you our next set of speakers. I am proud first to introduce Moctesuma Esparza, the CEO of Maya Cinema, a member of the Commission on the Study for the Potential Creation of the National Museum of the American Latino, a longtime civil rights champion. As head of Maya Cinemas, Moctesuma has produced over 20 films, several for television, has won over 200 awards, including an Academy Award nomination, a Golden Globe nomination, and an Emmy Award. His films are known for their focus on Chicano themes and the Mexican-American civil rights and equality movements. He was named one of the 50 most powerful and influential Latinos by the Imogen Foundation. Welcome, Moctesuma. Next, we have Evonne Gallardo, the Executive Director of Self-Help Graphics and Art. Evonne has over 20 years' experience in working with arts and culture organizations, including the Dia Center for the Arts in New York and Artists for a New South Africa, a Hollywood-based charity. She has also developed special programs in partnerships with organizations including Creative Artists Agency, Lucasfilms, and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Evonne currently serves on the board of directors for the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture. And finally, we have Estuardo, oh, thank you, yes. Sorry, thank you, yes. And finally, we have Estuardo Rodriguez, who you've also already met. Estuardo is a principal of the Rabin Group, a public affairs consulting firm in Washington, D.C., and with offices here in Los Angeles. I'm going to add, very good friends here. He counsels both nonprofit and corporate clients on media and communication strategies targeted to Hispanic communities. Is a commentator and consultant on Democratic and Hispanic issues. Estuardo has appeared on CNN, CNN Español, and many other broadcast channels. He also serves the Department of State as an independent political analyst in Latin America, most recently in Chile and Spain. So before we have a chance to speak to this panel, we are going to see a clip of the upcoming film Chavez. As you may know, this is an exciting project from actor-director Diego Luna. It's the first feature film of this magnitude that has been made about the life of Cesar Chavez. And I'm going to just...
Farm workers in Delano, California have begun an unprecedented strike in the Central Valley.
We believe the United Farm Workers and their leader, Cesar Chavez, represent the hope and aspirations of the vast majority of farm workers.
Every American has a stake to bring about social change within the system.
So who the hell is this Cesar Chavez?
I heard he's Mexican. Seems a safe bet.
I'm angry that I live in a world where a man who picks your food can't feed his family.
We don't need you. We want you back to Mexico. Get the hell out of our country.
What do you think you're looking at, huh?
The citizens of Delano, they respect the law.
So do we, especially the Bill of Rights.
Have you seen the headlines they're getting? That's costing us real money, Mr. Bogdanovich.
We don't have to negotiate. We have to dictate terms.
Last report estimates that we've cost them $17 million.
We can't hold on much longer. We're gonna break this damn strike.
We have no laws to protect us here.
What if something happened to us?
With the boycott, there are no laws to stop us.
What would happen to the kids?
This is about being a man.
What are you doing? I'm standing up because somebody has to.
Mr. Chavez!
This is the moment, Cesar. This is what we came here to do.
You can't oppress someone who's not afraid anymore.
Well, that's great. It's really something very much to look forward to. And it's a good way into some of the topics we're going to touch on in this second panel. We're going to start, and then at some point we are expecting the congressman to join us, and when he does, we will cede the podium to him for a while, and then he'll go on about his business. So this second panel, my hope was that we would focus more on the medium rather than the message, on how the stories will be told in this place. Because this is a museum that's is being built now in a multimedia, in a digital age, and because it will deal with a population with such a distinct sensibility, so highly diverse as we heard recently, you've got to assume that because of the way it's starting, we're envisioning a kind of museum that's going to be somehow different than the standard sort of brick and mortar, highly static sort of places that were warehouses. The nation's attic is what the Smithsonian used to be called. I can't imagine a Latino museum that is an attic. But we don't have attics. I mean, I was going to say, I was thinking quickly, I don't think, you got swamp coolers in the time. Anyway, never mind. So, Moctesuma, I want to start with you, with this idea that, all right, so we know that museums are much less static than they used to be, that the Smithsonian does documentaries, it has a cable channel, it has online content, it's interactive, it's much more dynamic. So, and you've got a lot of Latino media creators now, like yourself, like Diego Luna, like so many others. What will this museum draw from Latino media creators today, and what will it give back to them? What is the significance of this museum in the context of where Latino contributions are to media in the United States today?
Well, I was thrown off by your comment that we were going to focus on the medium and not the content.
Well, we can talk about content.
Because I really don't care about medium, I care about content.
Okay, well, let's talk about content. I'm flexible.
Content to me is our story, right? What's missing in the institutions of the country is our story, right? So history, whether it's male, story, for me is a particular context, a particular construct that has a point of view that has been created by those that exercise power, right? The only reason that we're beginning to have this conversation is because we've reached the moment where we are beginning to exercise power. It's about power. And in exercising power, you get to be able to tell your story. So it's our story. And what's missing is our story in the context of the institutions who are the holders of the sacred story of this country. And what I think that we as the population that have been integral to the history of this country, to its creation, to its building, to its finance, to the blood that has been let to keep it together and to create it, is our contribution to that collective story. So that is what I think is at stake here. And that is what I think that all of us should be pursuing, is claiming our story in this context of history, and in the creation of this country, and in the future storytelling about what this country has meant to the world and to us individually, and the role that we played in it.
Agreed. And I think everybody, in much of what we talked about earlier was on that theme. I'm going to push a little bit on this. So the old story was told in things of like First Lady's gowns, right? Until there's a Latino First Lady, there's not going to be a Latino presence in that gallery, right? It may happen anytime, but that is a very old, there are ways of telling stories that the Smithsonian has had that are very fixed. Is this just a matter of replicating I mean, taking the American History Museum the way it is and simply creating a new version of it with Latino content in it? Well, I mean, that alone would be a significant achievement, but is that the objective here, to simply say, it's going to look exactly the same, it's going to be organized exactly the same way, except it's going to be about Latinos?
Well, I suppose that if our historic culture had not been disrupted, now I'm now speaking of the indigenous people, right, that we are coming up from, if that culture had not been disruptive, then perhaps the headdress of Moctezuma would not be in Austria, it would be here in the Americas, and whatever the accoutrements of power and would be part of our historical legacy, and they would be part there, but that didn't happen, right? So what we have is a legacy of a working class people. And so what's important to a working class people is different, right? So Cesar Chavez's hoe, which the short hoe that broke so many people's backs, is far more interesting to me than a future Latina's inaugural gown ever will be, right? So I think that we must bring a new sensibility, a new standard for what is important that is reflective of our particular history, our particular story in terms of the journey that we have taken. And our journey has been a journey of working class people in the main. Now there are, of course, now folks that are beginning to be successful and that are accumulating wealth and that are interested in new things. But even they, at this moment, are not more than a generation away from their working class heritage. And so it is still alive. And I think that we have an opportunity to define our story in a new way that can begin to continue to move forward the American dream, right? That American promise that for me only has value as it is a beacon for the entire planet. Because the entire planet has people here who are all have come here because of some war, some massacre, some dislocation, some genocide. They're all here. We're all here. And so the whole planet has a claim on this dream that equality, that the worth of the individual, that the pursuit of happiness is a human right. So we have an opportunity to define it in a new way and to let our origins, our struggle, our bloodletting define that as an opportunity to refocus what the American dream is about and to redefine it as something that is actually for everyone. That would be what I would say.
Excellent. Very good. Let me, Evonne, turn to you for a moment here on a slightly different aspect of this story. You are very much involved in the ongoing process of Latino cultural creation, and in your work and that of the people you're associated with is a very vivid way of seeing that the subject of this museum is still in a process of actualization, that it's still very much defining itself, very much in a process of cultural production. How do you see this museum capturing that ongoing aspect of the development of the Latino identity, this ongoing production of cultural content?
Well, I appreciated the comment that Pilar made about we're catching up on a number of levels, but I always use the metaphor as we're building the bridge as we cross it. And I think that when you are both looking at the past and in the future, you have this folding of time that you're present in. I always say I love art. You know, we're talking about these concepts and the subject matter in a very conceptual way. But the work is made by people that are, many of whom are alive today, the artists namely. And so I speak representing that perspective. I think that our stories are ever evolving. They're new every moment. There's a new story that comes into the Latino experience. And I think that the action of art, the action of creating or presenting, is a way of managing that story from a subjective perspective, but also in the act of making it. That's a very, it's a powerful moment, not only for artists, but the communities that participate in that action. I think this museum has a really exciting opportunity to create a new model for what is being thrown around in the sector as social practice. Self-help graphics and art has been practicing social practice for decades since its inception, where artists engaged communities in the act of making art. Through its Barrio Mobile Art Studio, where it, in 1974, piled a bunch of art supplies and artists into an old truck and drove around in the community, took the art to the people. Nowadays, you hear this being a very valued and primary focus of major museum institutions wanting to engage its public in those same type of social practices. So we have a history of this, and yet it's so relevant today. I think that understanding what the national Latino arts sector is about and what they're doing, and seeking partnerships in those different art centers, artists, artist collectives, is going to help present those stories as they're being created today. Continue to remain relevant, not just about looking back about our accomplishments in our story, but also valuing the stories that are being created today. So when we talk about how a Latino museum could be different, I think this is one of the ways that it could, really focusing on social practice as a core characteristic of the museum and how it presents our story. It is, you know, we appreciate art, Latinos appreciate art, but we love making it too. We wanna participate, right? We're about art in action. So I would hope that that legacy of social practice becomes a defining characteristic of this new museum.
No, and you could, you know, it's very interesting to think about how that could be applied not just to art, but to the curation of history as well. That it could be something that goes out of the mall and into communities, and whether you know, as Moctesuma was saying, if this is a working class history, if it's a history, if it's a museum about people who are still actualizing themselves, does it play a different social role as a result of that? Estuardo, you're very close to the discussions ongoing, the ideas that are being kicked around about what this will be. And I was wondering when you could talk to us a little bit, maybe starting with this aspect of it, what thoughts there are about beyond the mall, the role that this museum will play. We'll start from the outside in, talking about its role out in the country, and then talk about its role on the mall.
Well, ultimately, the Smithsonian will have to develop a guiding body, a board, an advisory board of some kind that will decide what goes in the museum and also how it operates with the audience, with the public. And that goes into the idea that they be mobile, that they engage beyond you know, the brick and mortar of the what you know, hopefully will be the Arts and Industries building. Our focus, though, over the last few years that we, and when I say we, my firm, the Raven Group, had volunteered several years ago to help Congressman Becerra and Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton out with this idea and the initiative to create the museum. And we've raised our hands back then, and our hand is still up 6 years later. We're still helping message and engage the Latino community. What we try to do is go to several of the established Latino markets in the country and those new growing communities as well, to learn more about what motivates the Latino community in those cities. Why do we do that? Because we ultimately need their help in picking up the phone, sending emails, sending letters, and calling members of Congress and letting them know that there's a need, there's a desire, there's an interest in creating this museum. And what we've learned, and my background personally, I wasn't a history major. I didn't study Chicano art or Chicano studies or anything like that. I went the boring route of doing political science and then law school. And so what I have learned and what I've experienced, and I think my team as well, we've gone through a hands-on history lesson, market by market. Wherever we go, if we're in Florida, if we're in New York, it's a history lesson of the influence, the depth of the Latino community's role in those markets, how they have affected the growth and the success of some of these markets, some of these cities. So I think what we ultimately walk away with as we leave Minneapolis-St. Paul, which we did this summer, in New Orleans, which has an amazing history, but also a contemporary history of Latinos who helped rebuild New Orleans. So these stories we take with us when we go back to Washington to find and develop a better way to get people excited about this. Social media is really the way that we best mobilize people and educate them about the legislation. Let them know that it's good and bad, because we also get people who ask us, when's the museum opening? And so you actually start. You were going to ask that? Sorry, yeah, don't ask that yet. But that's part of the learning process here. We do a history lesson based on the information we have. We get back from the community a history lesson, because there are people there who say, my grandfather was in World War II, my great-grandfather served this country. Amazing stories that we get that run the gamut of how the Latino community has helped build the country. And what we push back out there is, are those stories market by market to get people excited, get them engaged. And I think, back to your question, I think that's ultimately what this museum might offer. It might offer the opportunity for people to share their stories. There is a video service, and you might remember this. I believe it's StoryCorps. StoryCorps does an amazing job of having people go into a little studio on camera. They tell their stories and they archive all these stories. You can go online to storycorps.org, I think. And that, I think, is the potential that the Smithsonian American Latino Museum will have to let people come in and share their stories about their grandparents and great-grandparents and all the contributions and sacrifice that have been made.
There's a marvelous example of that at UT Austin, where an old friend and former colleague, Maggie Rivas Rodriguez, has for years been collecting stories of Latino World War II veterans, and has built now a very substantial oral history archive, photographs, artifacts, all associated with Latinos of that generation. And it managed to capture it. I mean, that was something almost evanescent there, because these were stories that were going to be completely lost if somebody didn't capture them. And there are pieces of the Latino story around the country like that could be connected somehow by an institution like this and made more accessible. But without asking when it's going to open, what's the next? Tell us a little bit about the process. I mean, what's happening in Washington? What are the next steps? Where does this sit?
That's great. What's happening in Washington? I think people ask that all the time. What is happening in Washington?
Well, yeah, at least on this little, or what's not happening on this little piece.
Right. One list is definitely longer than the other. So the museum has several pieces of legislation. The first one was to create the commission that Moctesuma served on, as well as Sid Wilson and others that have been supportive of this museum and the organization. The existing legislation is to reserve the Arts and Industries building. Many of you may know, and those of you who do not, the National Mall is basically sealed off. No one can build anything new. By law, no new structure can be constructed on the National Mall after the African American Art and History Museum. So if you want to create a museum on the National Mall, it has to be a structure that exists today. The only one that is vacant is the Arts and Industries building. So that piece of legislation that is there is the Smithsonian American Latino Museum Act to reserve the A&I building, commission a study within 18 months to tell the Smithsonian how, what the cost would be and how to convert that building into a future American Latino Museum. We're hoping that that legislation will go through this congressional session, which goes into 2014. We've been reaching out to members of both parties. There's a lot of support there, not enough action, but we're working both parties to try to get more support for them to do that. After that, and I'll summarize here, we still have two more pieces of legislation. One is federal funding. Because it's the Smithsonian, you're going to have to get some funding. Our goal is to raise a lot of it from the community, from the public and the private sector, and then the authorization itself. So without answering your question about timing, it's going to be a while.
Is that here? There he is. All right. Perfect timing. Let me just pause for a moment and introduce somebody who has really been at the heart and soul of this effort, going back, 15 years, almost 20 years. Congressman Xavier Becerra from the fair city of Los Angeles, who has kept, is not only pumped blood into this idea over and over and over again, but has really kept it alive. And we're really incredibly delighted to have you here. Great to see you. Great to see you. Thank you. We've been talking about this idea, what it could be, and some of the content. How long have you got? You want to talk to the crowd here a little bit? You want us to ask
crowd. It's great to see.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. How do you want to do this?
Well, first I just came to say hello, and it's great to see all you here. And Estuardo from DC, who's been championing this for quite some time as well. I'll just say a couple quick things.
Yeah, sure, please.
2003, I introduced the legislation simply because I couldn't believe that after 10 years after the Smithsonian had presented its report, Willful Neglect, about how the Smithsonian had not done what it believed it should have done. Try to present what it means to be an American from all perspectives, that it was time. And so when we introduced the legislation, my co-sponsor, my partner in crime throughout this process was Ileana Ross-Leitner from Florida, state of Florida, and she and I introduced the bill, and in the first few years we couldn't even get a hearing. And so finally, when we passed the legislation to create the commission simply to study whether we should have a museum, that was a success. Fortunately, the commission came back and in a rousing report said, absolutely, we should move forward. We better hurry, because there are a whole lot of folks that want to build museums. And in real estate, it's location, location, location. And if we're stuck out somewhere in the boonies with a museum of the American Latino, it's going to be tough for people to really get to know who we are. And so we have to hurry. And so quite honestly, what's really in front of us is the task of showing the private, public support for moving forward with the idea of a museum. And what that translates into is $500 million. If we can show that we can put money on the table, probably half of that, then we could probably work in Congress to get the other half. But that's a fair chunk of change. But that's what it costs. We are right now, I'm a regent on the board of regents for the Smithsonian. It's a great institution, and I love serving on the board. We're right now in the midst of construction of the Museum of African American History and Culture. And we're trying to keep pace because we're hoping that we can finish by 2015. Because 2015 is a significant year It marks 150 years since the president issued the Emancipation Proclamation, 50 years since the passage of voting rights legislation, and it's just so significant. And so we're hoping that, and I serve on the committee for the Museum of African American History and Culture as well. And so everyone that's part of this committee that helps try to fund the museum is working hard to make it happen. But that's a $500 million effort as well. And so it's great. There is no museum of the many museums that the Smithsonian has that has a greater Facebook following than the non-existent Museum of the American Latino. we have more followers than most every one of the museums in the Smithsonian, and we don't exist yet. And so clearly there's an interest, and the fact that you're here, I'm thrilled. I thought I might be having coffee with a small group of people. It's great that you're all here. So I just came by to say I happen to just finish another event, so I'll participate. I'll sit around.
No, please sit down here, please. If you've got a minute.
I got more. I got more than a minute.
Okay. Right. So let me ask: does anybody on the panel of this panel, or the past panel, have a question of the congressman? Let me. Can I ask you a contentious question?
Sure.
It's never happened before. Let's talk about the mall. The mall versus other places nearby. This has been a question since, going back to the late 1990s on this idea of this place, and that very specific definition of geography. And I know it's been important to you, and I just want you you touched on it briefly, but expand on the significance of there versus a few blocks, behind the HEW building or whatever.
I'll answer by asking, how many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Of those who've been to Washington, D.C., how many have visited one of the Smithsonian museums? How many of you have visited the Smithsonian's Anacostia Museum? It's not on the mall. It's it.
There you go.
It's it. You want to exist? You want to see the trees in the forest? You got to go to the forest. And the forest is on the mall. And it's not just so Americans can see it, so the world can see it. Because this museum, quite honestly, won't just talk about us as Americans. It'll talk about our ancestors and what makes us so important as Americans. You gotta strike. If you're gonna go mine for gold, you better go to the right shaft. And I don't, especially if you're gonna sink a whole bunch of money, $500 million into your investment. And Armando, we're gonna take some of your collection once we build that facility. You got it.
This is how even within Congress, you find divisions among Latino members of Congress on all kinds of issues. Surprise, surprise, right? As much as you try to round up all, everybody, and what is the sense on this issue? How much do you see the Hispanic caucus unified on this? You've gone around the country on this issue. Is there a sense that this is pulling people together at this point? Is it still?
This is not a partisan issue. As I said, Ileana Ross-Layton, who's Republican, is my co-sponsor, and we've worked it together. On the Senate side, Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat, and Senator Marco Rubio, Republican, have been the lead sponsors in the Senate of the same legislation. This is not partisan. The commission, membership on the commission, was from every walk of life, including non-Latinos.
Yeah.
I think most of us recognize the importance of having this. It'd be nice the next time they do a movie on a Medal of Honor winner that they use a Latino, or instead of having Jeffrey Hunter play the role of, Guy Gabaldon from World War II, when he helped save the lives of countless hundreds of American soldiers and saved thousands of Japanese soldiers by having them surrender.
Well, it's nice when they actually make a movie about an actual Latino. You know, like the guy in Tehran, that you actually, you know, say that he's a Latino as opposed to like pretending that he's not. Anyway, that's, yeah. Tony Mendez. I mean, Tony Mendez. The guy has his name, and they just pretended that he's not a Latino. I mean, never mind. Don't get me started.
And I guess I wouldn't have minded if Jeffrey Hunter had played Guy Gabaldon. And they turned the character into an Italian-American. And I love Italian-Americans.
So, another semi-contentious question that has come up in this discussion in the past. So is this museum like 60% Mexican American, 10% Cuban? How do you divvy up the real estate? Given, I mean, these, you know, you're laughing because it's not. I didn't make up this question, right? And
you know, the great thing is we'll get to fight about that once the museum's built.
People have been fighting about it already, huh?
We'll lock arms together. I don't think that's going to be an issue. I've had ambassadors from all over Latin America come and say, we want to help you. We want to help you. And I think everyone sees this as that jewel that will let us tell the story of America, but because we know that the story of America goes far beyond the borders of the United States of America. It's so important. And I don't think you're going to see a fight. I think the fight will be that we collectively, whether you're Cuban American, Puerto Rican, Central American, South American, Mexican American, it's going to be one of those things where Dominican American, see, that's the problem.
Yeah, right. And keep going, huh?
And I'm looking at my Dominican American.
Yeah. Did you mention Ecuadorian Americans? Excuse me.
Well, I said South American, so I get but we're going to fight to build this thing.
Yeah.
And then I think it's okay to have the fight inside the house, right, of what we should put in. But the great thing is we're going to have a place to put these things in. And I don't think it's going to be a fight to the death. I think it's going to be a healthy fight to make sure we display the best of who we are. Remember, when I was in college, I just came from Cal State LA from a presentation about millennials and so forth. When I was in college, I was Chicano. I'm Latino now. And I'm first and foremost American, right? But I don't try to distinguish between my Latino heritage as of Mexican ancestry, because I think it's important to take on the struggles of all of our brothers and sisters, including those who aren't Latino.
Javier, I never stopped being a Chicano, and I'm also Latino.
Yeah.
I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, nor do I think that we need to give anything up.
I agree. I mean, I'm still Chicano. That's not going to change. But I identify myself as Latino. Yeah.
Yes, as I do. We all need a big tent. And that's the point. However, our brothers and sisters, you know, in New York and in Miami, right? They don't stop being Cuban, and they don't stop being Puerto Rican. And they say that first, and I respect that. And when we're in the big tent together, we're all Latinos.
We'll have a room in the museum devoted to all of this, okay? So it's like the post-partisan. The fight is to get the museum, and it's great to see so many of you here. But listen, I think, so the reason that folks are here is the interest. The next thing is, are you serious? And as Estuardo will tell you, serious means money. That's really what it's about. And we're fortunate. The Smithsonian, which is neutral on the issue, because the Smithsonian will say we're for whatever we get the money to be for. The Smithsonian has been they're neutral, but they've been very open to the idea. There is one site left on the mall. It's called the Arts and Industry Building. In fact, it's the most historical of all the Smithsonian buildings. It's the very first building built through the Smithson money. When Mr. Smithson decided he wanted to have this as an institution to expand knowledge, that's what they built. But it wasn't built to be a museum quality interior, so it's going to take a lot of work. But that, because it's so old, built in the 1860s, I think it was, it's beginning to collapse. So we're putting up money to shore it up. And there are a whole lot of folks who would love to snatch that building.
I read a story recently about a push for an immigration museum. Is this one of those ideas? Yeah. How does the politics of that work? What is the interchange there? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's a great idea. There's an idea from the Museum of, well, they call it the Museum of Immigrants, of New Americans, and there's a big push to have a museum of women. There's a proposal to have a museum for children. There's a museum, an idea for a museum of innovation. I think all are great ideas. I would go visit all of them. But I want to visit the Museum of the American Latino on the Mall.
So I am reminded to ask you, if you haven't already written down questions, to do so now, because they're going to be collected and we're going to turn to your questions momentarily. So what do people do? I mean, money, you're going around to people with who write big checks, I assume, for this. What else do people do if you're interested in this? What do poor academics like us do?
Write little checks. Cada uno puede dar su granita de arena. Little by little. Se puede, ¿verdad? I think what we have to do is just make it very clear that there is not just the desire, las ganas, but that there's the wherewithal. That's always a big question. Can you make it happen? No one wants to get behind, something that's not going to be a winner, and it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money for a community that's struggling in so many different ways. And it's so far away. Why not do it? I've had folks say to me, why don't you just help build a museum in LA? We could. I just happen to see a whole bunch of folks who go to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And when they go visit those museums of American history, of natural history, Air and Space Museum, American art, then the museum that's not far away. There's no other place in the world that you can go to understand what it means to be an American as quickly as going down the National Mall. And when you go through that, and at the end you come out and you say, geez, where was the spot for all the African Americans who built this country? Where was the spot about the Chinese Exclusion Act? Where was the part about the Mayans who discovered zero and irrigation, and about Cesar Chavez? You need to have a museum. And your interest here has to translate into something more than the city. I always tell people when I try to raise money for myself, but I'll say, how much did you spend on that nice meal with your spouse or the person you're courting? And was it worth it? Most of the time they say yes. And I'll say, is it worth it to get somebody to do good work for you in Washington, D.C.? And so hopefully they'll sometimes say yes, but is it worth it to us to have a museum that represents what Latinos have meant to this country? Is it worth that meal that you had with someone? That's a pretty good chunk of money.
Roberto, I'll jump in and just say to your question of what people can do. We have a full website, AmericanLatinoMuseum.org, that invites you to participate in some way, get involved in some way. As the Congressman said, we have the largest following of any existing and non-existing museum. 130,000 people on Facebook and 150,000 on Twitter. When you look at the larger Latino community, which is 50 million growing, that's just a drop in the bucket. So we've got a long way to go, and our hope is to activate all those people via email, via social media, activate them to help push the legislation through, to help with the fundraising that we need. So there are a lot of things that you can do, and you can just start by visiting the American Latino Museum.org website.
So this is a question for the Congressman. Sorry, Becerra. Yes. What is the biggest challenge that this legislation faces? Because it's going to be hopefully approved in the next year. Is that correct? Maybe, maybe not.
I won't say it's partisan because it's
Partisan.
no. It's look. It's very political. It's location. It's the money, and so it goes beyond partisanship. There are Republicans and Democrats supporting it, and while I think for the most part Democrats are supportive, there probably are some Democrats who aren't when it gets down to the money and the location, and so it's some people have still have an aversion to creating a museum of Latinos. This idea of breaking up into ethnic enclaves. There were a lot of people who weren't supportive of doing the Museum of African American History and Culture. Why not just have more displayed in the Museum of American History? And so I think there's a validity to the concern, which is, aren't we one people? And therefore, don't we need just one museum to talk about our collective history? I think would love to say yes, except for 150 years, you've neglected the collective and focused on too much of just one side. And so, since you never have done it right, it's time for us to do it right if we have to do it through these museums. So it's just, it's politics, but it's tough politics because it's not as if there are a whole bunch of locations, good locations that you can easily turn to, and it's not as if these days Washington is flush with money.
This is an interesting question about that Congressman and anybody else on the panel can address. So you had mentioned that the museum would show the best of who we are. What about the underside of Latino life, the questioner asks? As all cultures have, of course, gangs, drugs, coyotes, etc., where does that side of Latino life fit in the portrait this museum is going to paint? I'm not going to put you on the spot necessarily. I'm going to let one of our other panelists try this first.
I think
John?
that's easy.
Yeah, okay.
Right, so that's an expression of the individual artist. And to the extent that the individual artist captures some of the pain and angst and suffering or depravity, right? That is an artistic expression, and to the extent that it has a distinctive voice, quality, then it deserves a space. So it's a question of what it is that we are creating as artists. Now, there are tons of examples that point to what you just discussed. The point is, we're not creating it. Hollywood's creating it. There are more than enough images of undocumented coyotes, drug dealers, gang members, and depravity that is not coming from the art that is coming from our community, right? So if an artist wishes to present it and it comes out of their life experience, their inspiration, then it has a place in the museum. If it reaches a quality of distinction and is meritorious of being preserved.
Sorry, add on to that, you can see works that represent that currently in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in the Our America exhibition. The photograph by Delia, for example, is about border crossing. And so artists speak in the vernacular that, that is most immediate to them. They respond to their experiences, and you already see that work integrated into contemporary art. You might not necessarily know it or realize it. If the museum also has more historical exhibitions that have a different kind of frame that is
not from an artist perspective, but more of artifacts. I mean, I would hope that the museum and the curators and whomever is going to ultimately design the exhibitions for the public would include an honest breadth and look at what the experience really is.
And also, as it's being told from our perspective, you might get a fuller picture of why is that young man in jail? Here's one of the perspectives. We have zero tolerance policies got adopted in the 1990s because of fear of the super predator that's going to tear society apart. Zero policy, zero tolerance policy. So if you're a young student here in Los Angeles and you are tardy, 1 second, no tolerance, you get the ticket, that's $300. You're an immigrant family, you're earning $600 a month, a $300 ticket. In West LA, that's a dinner. In some places, that's your entire month's rent and food. 2 or 3 tickets, you're up to $1,000. They triple. You're arrested at school. You're taken towards the judge. It's called the school to prison pipeline. Well, yeah, there's a young man in jail. There's a prisoner. God, they're horrible. Well, let's look at the entire policy pipeline. How did they get there? What's happening in this country? That would be the new story.
That's why you need a museum. That's why you need a museum. Interesting. By the way, the Smithsonian has about 140 million artifacts. They don't have space. And so there's not going to be any problem putting up any number of things in any one of these museums that we build, including the Museum of the American Latino at some point in the future. And it's going to be up to the artists and the curators as to what we put. But I have no fear that we'll have enough to display that tells a very rich and full story of who we are.
You know, one of the ideas we were kicking around before you came that I find very intriguing is how you imagine that this initiative changes the Smithsonian as a whole. So that, I mean, is there that potential that creating this museum, creating a staff for it, creating a voice inside that institution, can you really hope that you're then that you will change the exhibits in the Museum of American History to be more reflective of, or that you change some of the mindsets in what are an amazing number of institutions?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, how many of us here could give you a good recitation of the history of the Mayans and tell you what life was like? I could tell you pretty well what happened in the Middle Ages in Europe, but I really can't tell you what was going on in the Americas in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century. I bet you it's a fascinating history, and I'd love to know more about it. And I think a lot of Americans would too.
It's interesting looking at the questions we've collected so far, and I don't know whether anybody else has others they want to send forward. We have one request to me from my colleague Billy Vela, which is to tell everybody to look at the USC's homepage, usc.edu, because El Centro Chicano is like all over the front page of. And it is Billy was telling me before, it seems to be the first time that one of the student service organizations has gotten this much play, and it is the new mural. And I may, while we're fiddling with the next question, I may try and display it up here. But the rest of the questions, interestingly, and there are like 8 of them, all have to do with the fundraising. So are there forces?
Wanting to give?
Well, no. There's not a check here. All these little pieces of white paper. But are there forces opposed to the creation of the museum? What is the fundraising strategy? Have you considered school-age children? Have you considered crowdsourcing? What evidence is there that people are actually supporting this beyond the likes in social media? So they're all, interestingly, about implementing this idea, which may be, Congressman, you and Estuardo can address a little bit about, since there seems to be real curiosity about how this thing is actually made to happen.
So yes, the likes, social media, those numbers are great indicators that there's support, that there's interest. But really, when we travel, every year we hit at least 5 to 7 markets. Miami this year, New Orleans, Houston, Las Vegas, Nevada. We've also gone to New York and Chicago. So every market that we go to, it's the turnout. It's the turnout of people that also represent their own networks of community organizations, their networks of art and museum and cultural centers. That feedback, that enthusiasm is real. We have presented to the Smithsonian Latino Centers convening of executive directors of Latino museums and cultural centers around the country. They've brought in high school students to talk about the opportunities with the Smithsonian and the arts world and opportunities there within the Smithsonian structure. We've also met with a number of fellows from the Smithsonian Center's program, Latino Center's programs. Everywhere we go and every audience that we engage, Houston had about 200 people, New Orleans had about 200 people, and we live streamed to another 800 people. Every time we unveil the campaign, the feedback is always positive. You'll have 1 or 2 people who will enter, maybe more than that enter into the debate of what would be in the museum, as the Congressman said. You know, that fight we're going to have once we all can look at a structure, and as soon as we stop clapping, then we'll start fighting about what goes in there. But in the meantime, we do have an open opportunity with these forums to let people come in and ask these questions. And even if there are disagreements, in the end, the enthusiasm is so tangible. And I'll wrap up with the media attention that we've gotten this year alone has been incredible. Outside of Washington, in Houston and Florida, and many other markets, there's been a lot of reporting and telling of this whole campaign, and the comments to those news articles are normally very positive as well.
I would only add that I don't think there's any doubt that folks would love to see that, or the museum be built, especially those who are Latino or who understand the history and contributions of Latinos.
But it's a legitimate question, because simply liking something doesn't make it happen. These days it really does take money, and for the Latino community sometimes that can be tough. People always tell me, but you know, Latinos don't give. If you take a look at the remittances that go out, and David is here, David probably knows this better than I do.
$32 billion this year.
$32 billion. Latinos are probably as giving as any community in this country, except that we give to those folks we left when we came over to this country and we're still struggling. And the amount that we invest back home for a lot of these folks, it's tremendous given how much they actually earn here. And so I don't blame them for making their first contribution back to grandma or their mother who's still back home, because they're still struggling. We just have to be able to take some of the success of their kids, me being one of them, for example, and have those folks who have more capability to understand it's our turn now to invest, so we can tell the story of the abuela who never got to come, but made it possible for the young woman or man to succeed in America and make it, and is still not sending back money to the mother or to the grandmother. That's important. And one last point, and I have to run, I apologize. I see David Ayon in the back there. He'll remember this well. When I was at Stanford, I lived at one of the dorms there. Was the Latino theme house, the Chicano theme house. It was called Casa Zapata. And the dining room for Casa Zapata had a huge mural. It had 3 images. There was a young Latina, very vibrant, on one end, and there was an older woman, very old. You could see it, the gray hairs, the wrinkles, the gaunt face, Latina, at the other end. And in between, the image in between was of a blonde-haired, fair-skinned female, but without a face. And you want to talk about conversation. that always stirred conversation and criticism, because so many people would walk into this dining room to have a meal, and here they see these two Latino faces and a white face with nothing, just blank. It was just the color, no features, nothing except the hair. And many people took offense to that. And I can understand why. But it stimulated conversation. And it made people think. Didn't mean they liked it, but it sure made people think. Have a Latino museum. It'll stimulate conversation. It'll make people think. Important.
Great.
Thank you for that. I got to
Great
run.
last word. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks so much. Great to see you. Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause to our panelists, please. So I want to, this is not part of this wasn't originally part of the program. We have some guests with us today. I want to preface their remarks by explaining to you my team's experience as we travel around the country. When I am in New York, we talk about the American Latino Museum, and the majority of the audience is Puerto Rican, and they talk about how the Puerto Rican story must be told. When I am in Texas, we talk about the museum, and often it's about the Mexican influence in the country. And I've even had people ask me, isn't this museum really the Mexican American Museum? The history that we have to tell is a history of so many different people that are thrown into one bucket here in this country. But we know the reality. We all have different experiences, different cultures within our own pockets of this country and beyond the borders. So we will have, as the Congressman said and some others said, we will have our disagreements. I became aware of this organization, whose director joins us today, several months ago when they lodged a very direct campaign against us because of our use of the word Latino. I had the pleasure of sitting down with them this morning, and I think that many of us agree with the mission that they have of telling the complete story of the Mexican, Native, and Indigenous people. So I beg your indulgence, because even in the disagreements that we have and that we will have, the opportunity to share those disagreements with all of us is greatly valued and important. So I've invited Olin Texcatlipoca and Citlali Anahuac from the Mexica movement to share their perspective and a few of their statements on what they've been working on. And hopefully, this will not be the last time that I work with them or have an opportunity to speak with them. So please, thank you. Come up over here, please. Thank you very much.
We are the voice not heard. The American Latino Museum is a museum of genocide for us. Genocide was defined by Raphael Lemkin as the planned and coordinated annihilation of a racial group by a variety of actions aimed at weakening the viability of the group and by undermining the foundations essential to the survival of the group as a group. This definition of genocide fits what is being planned and coordinated by the American Latino Museum. This museum's plans are genocidal by every measure and weight of the definition of genocide. The intent of this museum, the plans, what is being coordinated, is cultural castration of our people as indigenous people, of our people's identity. Our people are the Nicantlaka, the indigenous people of this continent. We are not Latinos. We are not Hispanics. Those are labels of the colonialist criollos of Miami that have been forced on our people with their colonial control of Spanish language media educational materials, and the government institutions that make those labels through the census and the government applications. The goal of this museum is to weaken, to destroy the viability of our Nicantlaca identity. The Hispanic Latino agenda is meant to exterminate any attempts by our people to separate our indigenous identity from that of the Spaniards and their Criollo descendants on this continent. The openly genocidal agenda has been planned and coordinated by the Cuban Criollos and other European descent people out of Miami. It is part of the ongoing genocidal actions taking place all across this continent. It is part of the terrorism and evils that Europeans brought on our people and our continent since 1492. The genocidal aspects of this genocidal museum can be seen in their final report to the President and Congress of the United States. In it, you can read how they are denying us our history. They deny us our Nicantlaca identity and our rights to the truth of the colonial crimes of the last 500 years. They are denying us the knowledge of our Holocaust, the extermination of 95% of our population. That Holocaust was caused by Europeans, European Spaniards, with the use of smallpox as a weapon of extermination. This museum whites out that knowledge of that Holocaust. The full knowledge of the European crimes of colonialism, their terrorism, their criminal and immoral actions, and their genocidal attacks on our race, our civilizations, and our culture. Problems with the American Latino Museum. The plans as they are now. The current plans for the American Latino Museum tell the story of the Spaniards and the Criollo descendants on this continent. In that part of what is called the United States of America, a more appropriate name for this museum should be the Spaniard and Criollo Museum of America. The purpose of this museum is to glorify that Spaniard Criollo history on our continent. That is the story they are really telling with this museum. It is not just a white European history of European invasions, it is a whitewashed history. And it tells it like Disney telling the animated history of the Holocaust and calling it the camps for Europeans during World War II, not mentioning the Jews or the extermination, the gas chambers, the theft of Jewish lands and their property, etc. They would tell us that it was all fun at camp with no war going on in the background. The American Latino Museum will tell of the glories of the Spaniards and their invasions and settlements and missions and explorations and their encounters with us, the Nicantlaca, the indigenous people of this continent. The museum will be a glorification of the Spaniards and their Criollo descendants. There will be zero mention of the civilizations and cultures that were here and destroyed. There will be no mention of the smallpox Holocaust that killed 95% of our population. There will also be no mention of the theft of our lands, the rapes, or the enslavement of our people. There will be no mention of the theft of gold and silver from the Mexica and Inca cities that now and how that wealth was used as a foundation for modern European capitalism, and how that capitalism financed the exploration and destruction of our civilizations and the extermination of 70 to 100 million of our people. The direction of the museum. This is a quote from the American Latino Museum. Both the centuries-old Latino communities in America and the newest of Latino immigrants share the same desire to be part of the American fabric, to build upon the American dream, and to contribute to our mutual success in the way the Germans, Italians, and Irish did. That quote from the Friends of the American Latino Museum makes no mention of Nicantlaca, the indigenous people who have been here for over 50,000 years. That is no accident. It is part of the genocidal historic actions of Spaniards and Criollo descendants for the last 500 years throughout our continent to the present day. This museum is being aimed at the American Latino population, which is 80 to 90% in indigenous people, full blood and mixed blood. This is clearly not a Latino population. We are misrepresented, mislabeled as Latinos. We are being told that we are the invaders of our own lands, that we are the criminals that committed genocide on our own people. Our people have been intentionally kept ignorant of the true history and identity of our people for the last 500 years. The current Cuban, Criollo, television, Spanish language media promote this genocidal agenda. We have been mislabeled as Hispanic Latino in a fraud that intends to destroy our sense of our true pre-1492 history and our true Nicantlaca identity. This museum is intended as a last nail in the coffin of our existence.
What do we not want? We don't want to be represented as the Latino European invaders who colonized our continent and destroyed our civilizations. That is not who we are. We are not foreigners on this continent. We are Nicantlaca, the indigenous people of this continent. We, the full blood and mixed blood, are one people who were and are terrorized, raped, enslaved, and were exterminated by over 95% of our population over the last 500 years. We do not want a museum that tells us that they're going to tell the history of our people, but that tells us our history that it begins in 1492 with the European invasions. We are not the invaders, the ones who destroyed our cities and our civilizations and enslaved our people. We do not want to be represented as Europeans or as Latinos. That would be a lie. That would be a horrible act for us. It would be for us to participate in our own genocide. It is a fraud to label our people as Latinos and Hispanics. Our Nicantlaca indigenous populations are between 80 and 90% of the mislabeled populations of Hispanic and Latinos. We have woken from the lies and crimes of the last 500 years. We will no longer accept the evils of this genocide against our people. Our history does not begin in 1492. Our history goes through at least 6,000 years of civilizations on this continent, civilizations that are older than anything in Europe. And we have been here at least 50,000 years inhabiting this, all of our continent. This museum is a fraud and a genocidal crime and should not exist. The museum denies the Holocaust of our people and it should not be built. This museum is part of a planned and coordinated attack against our Nicantlaca indigenous history, identity, and our heritage as indigenous people. This is a blatant act of genocide. What do we want? We do want a museum that represents our people as Nicantlaca, as indigenous, as the majority indigenous population of Mexicans, Native Americans of the Southwest, the Native Americans of the Southeast, Northeast, and Northwest, and the Native Americans of this whole continent. We want our people represented in a Nicantlaca indigenous museum that includes our collective civilizations, our accomplishments, examples of our cities, and the unity of our people as one nation across our continent. We want the world to know that most of our pre-1492 population was living in large cities, large towns, that our tribal population was a minority, to end the misconception of us as a totally tribal people. We were no more tribal than the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Romans. We want the world to know that our civilizations made contributions to the world, that were not just in foods and cuisine, but in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, writing, calendar making, city building, pharmacology, engineering, and so much more. We also want the whole world to know of the genocidal crimes of the Spaniards, the English, the French, the Portuguese, the true Latinos, and the other Europeans who came to kill our people and to steal our lands and the wealth of our resources. We want the world to know that Europeans exterminated 95% of our people throughout our continent. They killed 70 to 100 million of our people with the intentional use of smallpox as a weapon of mass destruction and mass extermination. We want the world to know that Europeans enslaved, culturally castrated, and raped the remnants of the 5% of our population, forcing their names, their languages, their religions, and raped DNA into our people. We didn't ask for any of that. We want the world to know that the descendants of those Europeans still control our lands, our continent, and their colonial sediments of Europeans who rape the wealth of our lands, poison our continent, poison our people with their culture of greed, lies, destroy us with an ongoing acts of genocide. We want the world to know that we reject the Latino label and the genocidal intent of this museum.
So I thank everyone for coming out. I want to wrap up their comments by saying that they, the organization, the Mexicano Movement, has based their remarks on the commission report that was presented to Congress in 2011. There's so much that we can do to address every element, every culture, every history of our entire community. We will disagree, and we invite people to disagree with us publicly. I'm sure some of you are wondering why we invited them to make remarks so harshly against the American Latino Museum campaign, but it's a part of an ongoing conversation to ensure that no one's story is left out of the American Latino Museum. So thank you again for coming. I appreciate your time.